So child sexual exploitation is a form of child sexual abuse. It occurs when an individual or group takes advantage of an imbalance of power to coerce, manipulate, or deceive a child or young person under the age of 18 into sexual activity, or in exchange for something the victim needs or wants, for financial advantage or increased status of the perpetrator or facilitator. The victim may have been sexually exploited even if the sexual activity appears consensual. Child sexual exploitation does not always involve physical contact. It can also occur through the use of technology. So one point I just want to point out on here is that it can happen even without physical contact. So there's non-physical contact happening as well. With the kind of fast-paced movement of social media nowadays, the accessibility of children is really quite vast. There was actually a case in the Philippines of a mother who was encouraging her child to do certain acts on a webcam in exchange for money. Now, this is something that's really problematic. I know that's quite a disturbing thing as well, but certain things like this is actually happening. And what's happening as well is that I just want to take your attention to the age of 18, is that it's usually manipulation and deceiving as somebody who's under the age of 18. So at the age of 18 and under that, that's when you're legally a child. So what a lot of perpetrators do is that they prey on children once they're 17, and until there's a few months until they turn 18, and they start the whole grooming process, and they start to sort of reel them in. And then when it comes on to their 18th birthday, that's when they then make their relationship more official, and more adults try and sort of dodge the law on the legalities and make it out as if they're in some sort of consensual relationship. So child sexual exploitation is actually in the same coin as child sexual abuse, okay? But the way that we kind of define things really affects the way that sometimes we perceive certain situations as well. So child sexual abuse is typically seen as intrafamilial. It's seen as happening with younger children. It's seen as children generally have a lot more agency, and they have a lot more welfare as well, because there's a lot less victim blaming in this whole idea of child sexual abuse because of the way that it's perceived. Whereas when we see child sexual exploitation, it's typically more older children, it's extrafamilial, and there's a lot more victim blaming in this situation as well. And it's quite problematic as well when we think of things in this way and the way that we define things, because really, whether they're young or whether they are old, the kind of response to the support networks for these people should be the same, whether they're young or they're old. Does anybody know at what age a child sexual exploitation can start? Any age, yeah. But the key element with child sexual exploitation is the element of exchange. And it typically will start at the age of 4 for a child, because psychologically, at the age of 4, a child can understand the element of exchange and rewards. And that's what happens with child sexual exploitation. It's certain sexual favors in response for a phone or clothes or money or a roof over their heads in some situations. And just on that point as well, some people might think that, oh, children who go through maybe in looked after families, might be in foster care, might be, living in poverty, are going to be more vulnerable, and therefore they're the ones that kind of get involved in these things. But there's actually a lot of children that can come from all different backgrounds that are actually at risk as well. It's not just that a certain type of profile of a child is going to be more likely to get caught up in this in comparison to somebody else. Yeah, so some concerns. So children from all communities, genders, ages and backgrounds can be harmed and exploited by adults. And there's this issue of media unconscious bias as well. Like, if I was to say something like grooming, maybe what are some of the things that kind of come to your mind? I mean, does anybody want to shout out? Anybody got any ideas? Yeah, men abusing young girls. So already there's this kind of perception that it's always men abusing young girls. But actually there are also boys that can also be victims, and sometimes women are used to kind of coerce other people within this, and they can also just as likely be perpetrators also. So there is this kind of idea that, well, it's very black and white and we know how it works. And also sometimes, you might have a certain profile of somebody. You might think that, a perpetrator might be a typical Asian taxi driver. For example, if we're talking about grooming, a lot of the cases, sometimes people think of things like Rochdale or the Oxford cases. And if you think about who the perpetrators are there and the way the media kind of portrayed those, and it creates this kind of collective consciousness and this media unconscious bias to a certain extent. But we need to remember that a risky person and a perpetrator can be absolutely anybody. And a person who is a victim can be absolutely anybody as well. Okay? And so children from BME, black minority and ethnic communities, do not feature as much in referrals, and boys do not feature that much in referrals as well. There are lots of kind of barriers within the BME community. We specifically work within the BME community to try and raise awareness of this issue with that community. And there's lots of barriers towards getting people to report and to speak out about what's happening to themselves, and also to report if they hear of something as well. But when we hear about young boys, there's lots of different issues. So I might feel like more embarrassed to talk about these things. They have a certain image that they want to uphold. So sometimes it's more difficult for them to kind of come out and then report as well. I'm going to now hand over to Maham, who's going to be talking a little bit about certain models of CSE.
Okay, so we have various models of CSE. These models represent a larger framework that CSE follow or copies. They are the main models that we usually see and we talk about, and they're different from methods. Methods of CSE are not the same as models. Methods are used within the models to carry out CSE. For example, online or party model is a method employed in it can be employed in any of these models. So the most commonly known model is the relationship model. It was previously known as the older boyfriend model, but that did not take into account the fact that young men and boys can also be victims of CSE. So the relationship model is one in which an older person befriends a younger person and convinces them that they are in a healthy, sexual, consensual relationship, and then they coerce them into having sex with friends or associates. Now, the important thing to remember here is that the younger person thinks that they are happily in this relationship. They are consenting to whatever is going on. But nobody can consent to being exploited. Even if they are over the age of 16, which is over the age of consent, they can still not consent to being sexually exploited or any kind of exploitation. So that's the relationship model. And the inappropriate relationship model is one in which there is an inappropriate power or control by one person by the older person over a younger person. It can be, for example, a teacher exerting control over a student and that kind of a relationship, or it can be a nephew-uncle sort of a relationship. So it's an inappropriate relationship, basically. And then if we look at the network or organized crime model, this actually includes sex trafficking of young people, and sometimes across the country, internationally, or even between houses or hotels, young people are exploited and they're trafficked, and they're used as basically as for giving sexual favors, and it's an organized network of buying and selling of the sexual services of young people by perpetrators. Now, we have to remember that some of the people involved as perpetrators might be victims themselves in this situation. The gangs model is one in which sexual exploitation occurs through gang initiation, rituals, gang pressure, or as punishment for crossing areas or boundaries. And again, it is worth considering that many gang members are themselves victims of CSE in many situations. Now, if we stereotype people who are affected by CSE, or if we say that all CSE is carried out by Asian taxi drivers, that is quite dangerous, because if frontline professionals are then thinking like that, they're actually missing out on a lot of victims who are then, for example, if victims are not being sexually exploited through the traditional boyfriend-girlfriend model, then it can be quite dangerous because they're missing out on victims who are being exploited through different models or different methods. And the same goes as if you just focus on one kind of perpetrator profile, you're missing out on a lot of things. So if we look at technology these days, technology is so rampant that most of the CSC is happening online. And it's the street scene where children are approached by strangers is almost non-existent now. Over 50% of 10-year-olds have a mobile phone in this day and age, and they have access to at least one social media account. 10-year-olds, just think about that. So basically that gives easy accessibility to perpetrators to access children online. When children are playing games on the computer, they're on the internet, and that's how the perpetrators, they pretend to be somebody else. This actually happened that a man in America, he actually accessed a British girl, and they planned to meet up. He came to the UK and he raped her and went back to America. This all happened through online gaming where he accessed her. And 94% of children by the age of 14 have watched pornography. So that's just a statistic that shows that where children's idea of healthy sexual relationships is coming from is from pornography. If 94% of them have seen pornography, and that's really not, I would say that's really wrong. And I'm not sure if any of you are aware of the dark web, but on the dark web, there are actually 3.5 million child abuse images. Yes. There are various risk indicators to CSC. They can range from low, medium, or high indicators, and some of the examples are in front of you. For example, if children or young people are regularly coming home late or going missing, associating with unknown adults online or offline, secretive behavior, sudden change in appearance, designer clothing, expensive gadgets. So suddenly they're coming home with expensive gadgets. You don't know where that money is coming from, who's providing those gadgets. Multiple miscarriages or terminations, disclosure of serious sexual assault and withdrawing, staying out overnight with no explanation, association with gangs, experimenting with drugs, alcohol, peer-on-peer abuse is quite common as well. Children posing risks to others, being rewarded for recruiting other children into sort of like a network or a gang, having a much older boyfriend, girlfriend, and being seen as hotels and parties. So I did mention hotspots. There are hotspots that young people generally hang out in, and those are quite dangerous places for perpetrators to know that this is a place where children hang out, and that's easy accessibility. And also parents these days, they put pictures of their children in school uniforms on Facebook or other kinds of social media, which is not advisable because then perpetrators would know which school the children are going to, and that also gives easy accessibility. So just little bits and bobs that if people know about, they wouldn't do them, and that just makes their children more safe. So there was a Not on the Radar report, which was published by Barnados, and it talks about two children, L and M, who belong to the BME community, and they were part of a group of children identified at risk of CSC. And the children were all in the same school, and they were seen as getting into cars with unknown strangers, getting paid in return for performing sex acts. Now, these children had frequent missing episodes from home, but the family struggled to report them missing because there were cultural factors, and then there were also language barriers. So the families did not report them missing. So this is just some piece of work that is done on this. Actually, we need more research into child sexual exploitation in BME communities. We were really struggling to find good research in this area. But the Muslim Women's Network UK published a report called Unheard Voices in September 2013. That was actually the first piece of real work done with regards to BME communities and child sexual exploitation. And this report actually says that victims of CSC come from all ethnic backgrounds, and regardless of how conservative or protected they may appear. So for example, I actually go into faith communities and faith groups and talk to faith leaders and people in faith communities, and they say that no, our children are safe. The children that come in this temple, they're safe. Nothing like that happens in our temple. And I say that's actually the reason why we're out there, because no child is safe. Everyone under the age of 18 in particular is vulnerable. And then there are cultural and religious views that prize female virginity or heterosexuality, and then these views actually perpetuate the fact that it's very difficult to disclose CSC for people coming from these communities because they fear a retribution or rejection from families. And then, but in particular, girls and women of Indian and Pakistani heritage who have been sexually abused or exploited are less likely to report their abuse because of concerns about their marriage prospects. What will people say if they find out I've been abused? Who's going to marry me? That sort of a thinking. And then they fear that they're going to themselves become victims of honor-based violence by their family, within the family. So that's why they usually don't report that they've been abused. And then males, as Hena mentioned, males find it particularly difficult to disclose abuse because in communities where there's homophobia is quite prevalent, and heterosexuality is prized. Males would find it very difficult to report a CSE because they would think that what if people think we are gay, and what if we are disowned from our families, rejected from the community. So that was all a part of the Unheard Voices report. Now the other report, so if you see the gap between the first report, that was in 2017, and the next real piece of work which we looked at came out in 2017, but now there's more research coming up, so some piece of work is being done on this now. The Children's Society report was conducted last year actually, and it actually followed some young South Asian women from Coventry and Birmingham, and just looked at how they engaged with frontline services, and how and why they remain silent and they don't disclose it. It's basically, for some families, fear of shame and ostracization from community is so strong that daughters are offered an ultimatum that do not disclose the abuse further, or you will be disowned and punished by the family. So that is a really strong thing that's going on, because obviously they would not want to be disowned from the family, so they choose to just remain silent. And honor and shame is integral to their experience of CSC. And this is further played on by perpetrators to manipulate them into more exploitation and keeping silent. This report also says that patriarchal social structure, where women are expected to uphold a certain image of family honor and fulfill certain roles they are not expected to challenge. So basically, in some communities, women are considered to be the upholders of honor, basically. It's all on the women's shoulders. Whatever they do, if they can't, they shouldn't do this, they shouldn't do that, they shouldn't dress in a certain way, they shouldn't speak out in a certain manner. So then they just choose to remain silent and not disclose the abuse. And they have a lot to lose if they do disclose. For example, family honor, social community standing, the idea that if they have been raped, they have lost their bodily honor. And it all comes down to who's going to marry me, what will people say about me. So, and young South Asian women often try and hide that they have a boyfriend. Then that makes it even more difficult to disclose the abuse. And the perpetrators once again take advantage of this and think they can get away with it. And even when they do come into contact with services, they have high levels of distress, and they find it, they disclose very late into their journey, and often they have no prior involvement with social care, and then when they're at breaking point, that's when they actually come in contact with services.
Just to make this even more depressing, I'm going to be talking about trauma and CSE. So for those people who go through child sexual exploitation, there's always an element of trauma that is then attached to this, with what they go through. Now, trauma affects children at a greater level the younger they are. So trauma doesn't have to be just about going through child sexual exploitation. It could be anything. So it could be like a loss of a parent, parents splitting up. It could be a massive car accident, for example, that really affects their development when they're older. So you can imagine that in this situation where child sexual exploitation is a really quite, extreme kind of situation, how much it has and how much of an impact it has on the development on children. They go on to then have really bad issues with relationships. They don't always know the difference between healthy and unhealthy relationships. They have difficulties formulating their own sort of coping mechanisms, and generally they tend to sort of hold the trauma with them for years and years and years until they might feel comfortable to speak out. This is very true for the BME community, because when they are going through all of these things and they have nobody to turn to, they don't have support services which they feel that they can engage in, they don't have a family or support networks that they feel they can speak to for so many of the reasons which Maham highlighted in the report, then what happens is there's a huge disconnect then between the connection between the young person and services and older people who are there to support them. And there is a school in Leicester where Maham and I work, and it's a faith school, and it has a very worryingly high level of self-harm, and there are actually cases of CSC there as well. Now, because the community in a way are in some level denial of the situation, unfortunately they're not always they're not allowing certain workshops on mental health and CSE into some of the schools, okay? And this is a huge problem. And this is something that we're obviously trying to tackle as well alongside that. And there's this kind of disconnect between my child doesn't do this, which is similar to what Maham was saying, that our children, we all belong to a particular community, a particular faith, so we're not going to get involved in all of these things. And it's just a complete, just turning the other cheek, just thinking it doesn't happen. And you can imagine when trauma has such a huge grasp on children and their development, and they have nowhere to turn to, then they end up growing up to have lots of other complex needs that need a lot of intervention. Another issue that has been emerged as well, or that's kind of been seen now, is that there's a lot of child-on-child inappropriate behaviour. Okay, so 1/3 of abuse is child-on-child. Okay, and a lot of the time when children are abused and they go through this cycle of exploitation, they then don't really understand what's right and wrong. So sometimes their development psychologically is obscured. And without that kind of intervention, they then start acting out and doing certain things which is inappropriate. There are programs that are out there to try and support children that have gone through this type of, exploitation and abuse to not kind of go down that route. It doesn't mean that every child that goes through abuse actually, does that, but we are seeing an emergence of that, and that's actually really problematic. Again, if we ignore that this is happening and children are having these kinds of sexual inappropriate thoughts towards other children, then you can imagine the kind of scope in the kind of problems that are there to have potential to develop. So it is really detrimental to cover this up. Some of the research in trauma talks about and tries to categorize behavior of trauma through something called the 5 Fs. So you might have heard of some of this before. So the 5 Fs are flight, fight, freeze, flop, and friend. So what happens is when somebody goes through some sort of abuse, they typically kind of fit into this kind of model or category of like their behavior. So fight is avoiding situations. They become very reclusive. They just want to run away. They don't want to sort of face anything. They just don't want to face what's going on because it's too horrific, and they just want to block it out completely. A fight is becoming very aggressive, sometimes having very strongly emotional and physical responses, which to the outsider would seem really irrational, and we don't always understand why it's happening. Sometimes it's that as well, where they're really like lashing out all the time. It can also be in a positive way as well, where some people who are being victims, they end up taking things up like self-defense, and they become more aware then of like the signs, and they become more protective of themselves. Freeze is a really interesting one, because that's when they just sort of don't really acknowledge anything that's going on. And what actually happens in these sorts of situations is the brain typically stops recording. So when somebody is going through some sort of exploitation or any sort of abuse that's just so horrific, their mind will stop kind of recording to be able to recollect what's happened. So you can imagine in the case of a court system, for example, when a victim has to talk about what's gone on, it's very difficult then for that victim to then recall clearly what's happened. So it's just the link between trauma and how much of a hold it has and how much of effect it has even going through the court system and then moving forward. Flop is the issue of depression, completely thinking, well, I don't have any worth and I deserve this and this is happening, so I'm just gonna take it. And friend is being very selective with the type of friends that person has. They can just be very secretive about what they're doing, and they often lead to having quite crumbling relationships. Now, all of that sounds really, really bad, and it is bad, but the point is that with intervention, they can get a lot more support and a lot more help to sort of pull forward. Okay, so CSE intelligence. So all of us have the responsibility to report, whether we're working as professionals in this area or we might be carers or guardians of somebody. Even if it's seen as just a rumour, then we still have the responsibility to report, and you can do that anonymously. So if you go onto the police website and you type in information sharing form, you'll be able to easily pull it up and you can put in the information. It's really straightforward and easy to fill in. What then happens is that the police will go, you don't have to say that it was from yourselves, the police will go and then they will then further investigate and then look into the issue. It's always better to be safe than sorry, even if it's nothing. That's what we're trying to advocate. So I'm just going to go into the summary. So just to summarize, CSE, key elements of CSE is exchange. It can happen as young as the age of 4, because that's when children can understand the element of exchange. Legally, a child is a child under the age of 18. A risky adult can be anybody. In the BME community, it's highly underreported and no community is immune. There are different models of CSC and different tactics and methods that are employed by perpetrators. There are multiple risk indicators and multiple kind of effects of trauma as well on young children that affects the development, and this is why it's really, really important for it not to be ignored. More effort is needed to talk about CSE more openly. Safeguarding needs to be more at heart of what we do. When we were at school, I'm sure a lot of us would know the phrase "stop, look and listen" when we were taught about crossing the road. Now we need to sort of have a phrase and a sort of more awareness for children in schools on how to be safe on the internet. Now that's got to that stage where we need to kind of have a lot more intervention within schools now, and that they become more aware of how to protect themselves. Abuse and trauma can lead to many complex mental health problems, and they need appropriate attention.